All right, I'm back. Still no sleep. Now I'm at the 24. I'm hitting 24 hours of no sleep now, so we're just gonna go ahead and read Tragedy and Hope, Section 5, the First World War, 1914 to 1918. Because that's how we do it here. We just don't go to sleep at all. All right. The growth of international tension 1871 to 1914, introduction, the creation of the Triple Alliance 1871 to 1890, the creation of the Triple Entente 1890 to 1907, efforts to bridge the gap between the two coalitions 1890 to 1914, the international crisis 1905 to 1914, military history 1914 to 1918, diplomatic history 1914 to 1918, intervention, attempts to make peace, the home front 1914 to 1918. All right. The growth of international tensions 1871 to 1914. Introduction. The unification of Germany. Whoops, I gotta take this. Hang on, this bookmark on. The unification of Germany in the decade before 1871 ended a balance of power in Europe which had existed for 250 or even 300 years. During this long period, covering almost 10 generations, Britain had been relatively secure and of growing power. She had found this power challenged only by the states of Western Europe. Such a challenge had come from Spain under Philip II, from France under Louis XIV, and under Napoleon, and in an economic sense from the Netherlands during much of the 17th century. Such a challenge could arise because these states were as rich and almost as unified as Britain herself, but, above all, it could arise because the nations of the West could face seaward and challenge England so long as Central Europe was disunited and economically backward. The unification of Germany by Bismarck destroyed this situation politically, while the rapid economic growth of that country after 1871 modified the situation economically. For a long time, Britain did not see this change, but rather tended to welcome the rise of Germany because it relieved her, to a great extent, from the pressure of France in the political and colonial fields. This failure to see the changed situation continued after 1890 because of Bismarck's diplomatic genius and because of the failure of non-Germans to appreciate the marvelous organizing ability of the Germans in industrial activities. After 1890, Bismarck's masterful grip on the tiller was replaced by the vacillating hand of Kaiser William II and a succession of puppet chancellors. These incompetents alarmed and alienated Britain by challenging her. It's page 211. No, it's 212. In commercial, colonial, and especially naval affairs. In commercial masters, the British found German salesmen and their agents offering better service, better terms, and lower prices on goods of at least equal quality, and in metric rather than Anglo-Saxon sizes and measurements. In the colonial field after 1884, Germany acquired African colonies which threatened to cut across the continent from east to west and thus checkmate the British ambitions to build a railway from the Cape of Good Hope to Cairo. These colonies included East Africa, Tanganyika, Southwest Africa, Cameroons, and Togo. The German threat became greater as a result of German intrigues in the Portuguese colonies of Angola and Mozambique, and above all by German encouragements of the Boers of the Transvaal and the Orange Free State before their war with Britain in 1899 to 1902. In the Pacific area, Germany acquired by 1902 the Caroline, Marshall, and Marianas Islands, parts of New Guinea and Samoa, and the base of naval commercial importance at Kiachau. on the Shaotung Peninsula of China. In naval affairs, Germany presented her greatest threat as a result of the German naval bills of 1898, 1900, and 1902, which were designed to be an instrument of coercion against Britain. 14 German battleships were launched between 1900 and 1905. As a consequence of these activities, Britain joined the anti-German coalition by 1907. The powers of Europe became divided into two antagonistic coalitions, and a series of crises began which led step by step to the catastrophe of 1914. International affairs in the period of 1871 to 1914 can be examined under four headings: the creation of the Triple Alliance, 1871 to 1890, the creation of the Triple Entente, 1890 to 1907, the efforts to bribe the gap between the two coalitions, 1890 to 1914, and the series of international crises, 1905 to 1914. These are the headings under which we shall examine this subject. The creation of the Triple Alliance, 1871 to 1890. The establishment of a German empire dominated by the Kingdom of Prussia left Bismarck politically satisfied. He had no desire to annex any additional Germans to the new empire, and the growing ambitions for colonies and worldwide empire left him cold. As a satisfied diplomat, he concentrated on keeping what he had and realized that France, driven by fear and vengeance, was the chief threat to the situation. His immediate aim, accordingly, was to keep France isolated. This involved the more positive aim to keep Germany in friendly relations with Russia and the Habsburg Empire, and to keep Britain friendly by abstaining from colonial or naval adventures. As part of this policy, Bismarck made two tripartite agreements with Russia and Austria-Hungary: A, the Three Emperors League of 1873, B, the Three Emperors Alliance of 1881, and B, I guess. Both of these were disrupted by a rivalry between Austria and Russia in southeastern Europe, especially in Bulgaria. The Three Emperors League broke down by 1878 at the Congress of Berlin because of Habsburg opposition to Russia's efforts to create a great satellite state in Bulgaria after her victory in the Russo-Turkish War of 1877. The Three Emperors Alliance of 1881 broke down in the Bulgarian crisis of 1885. This crisis arose over the Bulgarian annexation of eastern Rumelia, a union which was opposed by Russia but favored by Austria, thus reversing the attitude these powers had displayed at Berlin in 1878. The rivalry between Russia and Austria in the Balkans made it clear to Bismarck that his efforts to form a diplomatic front of the three great empires were based on weak foundations. Accordingly, he made a second string for his bow. It was this second string which became the Triple Alliance. Forced to choose between Austria and Russia, Bismarck took the former because it was weaker and thus easier to control. He made an Austro-German alliance in 1879, following the disruption of the Three Emperors League in 1882, expanded it into a triple alliance of Germany, Austria, and Italy. This alliance, originally made for 5 years, was renewed at intervals until 1915. After the disruption of the Three Emperors Alliance in 1885, the Triple Alliance became the chief weapon in Germany's diplomatic armory. Although Bismarck, in order to keep France isolated, refused to permit Russia to drift completely out of the German sphere, and tried to bind Germany and Russia together by secret agreement of friendship and neutrality known as the Reinsurance Treaty, 1887. This treaty, which ran for 3 years, was not renewed in 1890 after the new Emperor William II had discharged Bismarck. The Kaiser argued that the reinsurance treaty with Russia was not compatible with the Triple Alliance with Australia and Italy, since Austria and Russia were so unfriendly. By failing to renew, William left Russia and France both isolated. From this condition, they naturally moved together to form the Dual Alliance of 1894. Subsequently, by antagonizing Britain, the German government helped to transform this dual alliance into the Triple Entente. Some of the reasons why Germany made these errors will be examined in a subsequent chapter on Germany's internal history. The creation of the Triple Entente, 1890 to 1907. The diplomatic isolation of Russia and France combined with a number of more positive factors to bring about the dual alliance of 1894. Russian antagonism towards Austria in the Balkans and French fear of Germany along the Rhine were increased by Germany's refusal to renew the reinsurance treaty and by the early renewal of the Triple Alliance in 1891. Both powers were alarmed by growing signs of Anglo-German friendship at the time of the Helgoland Treaty, the Helgoland Treaty, 1890, and on the occasion of the Kaiser's visit to London in 1891. Finally, Russia needed foreign loans for railroad buildings and industrial construction, and these could not be obtained most readily in Paris. Accordingly, the agreement was closed during the New Year's celebration of 1894 in the form of a military convention. This provided that Russia would attack Germany if France were attacked by Germany or by Italy, supported by Germany, while France would attack Germany if Russia were attacked by Germany or Austria, supported by Germany. This dual alliance of France and Russia became the base of a triangle whose other sides were ententes, that is, friendly agreements between France and Britain, 1904, and between Russia and Britain, 1907. To us, looking back on it, the Entente cordiale between France and Britain seems inevitable, yet to contemporaries as late as 1898 it must have appeared as a most unlikely event. For many years, Britain had followed a policy of diplomatic isolation, maintaining a balance of power on the continent by shifting her own weight to whatever side of Europe's disputes seemed the weaker. Because of her colonial rivalries with France in Africa and Southwest Asia and her disputes with Russia in the Near, Middle, and Far East, Britain was generally friendly to the Triple Alliance and estranged from the Dual Alliance as late as 1902. Her difficulty with the Boers in South Africa, the growing strength of Russia in the Near and Far East, and Germany's obvious sympathy with the Boers led Britain to conclude the Anglo-Japanese alliance of 1902 in order to obtain support against Russia and China. About the same time, Britain became convinced of the need and possibility of an agreement with France. The need arose from Germany's direct threat to Britain's most sensitive spot by Tirpitz's naval building program of 1898. The possibility of agreement with France emerged in the wake of the most acute Anglo-French crisis of modern times, the Fashoda crisis of 1898. At Fashoda on the Nile, a band of French under the Colonel John Marchland, who had been crossing the Sahara from west to east, came face to face with a force of British under General Kirchner, who had been moving up the Nile from Egypt in order to subdue the tribes of the Sudan. Each ordered the other to withdraw. Passions rose to a fever heat while both sides consulted their capitals for instructions. As a consequence of these instructions, the French withdrew. As passions cooled and the dust settled, it became clear to both sides that their interests were reconcilable, since France's primary interest was on the continent, where she faced Germany, while Britain's primary interest was in the colonial field, where she increasingly found herself facing Germany. France's refusal to engage in a colonial war with Britain while the German army sat across the Rhine made it clear that France could arrive at colonial agreement with Britain. This agreement was made by 1904 by putting all their disputes together on the negotiating table and balancing one against another. The French recognized the British occupation of Egypt in return for diplomatic support for their ambitions in Morocco. They gave up ancient rights in Newfoundland and returned for new territories in Gabon along the Niger River in Africa. Their rights in Madagascar were recognized in return for accepting a British spheres of interest in Siam. Thus, the ancient Anglo-French enmity was toned down in the face of the rising power of Germany. This entente cordiale was deepened in the period of 1906 to 1914 by a series of Anglo-French military conversations, providing, at first, for unofficial discussions regarding the behavior in a quite hypothetical war with Germany, but hardening imperceptibly through the years into a morally binding agreement for British expeditionary forces to cover the French left wing in the event of a French war with Germany. These military conversations were broadened after 1912 by a naval agreement by which the British undertook to protect France from the North Sea in order to free the French fleet for action against the Italian Navy in the Mediterranean. The British agreement with Russia in 1907 followed a course not dissimilar to that of the British agreement with France in 1904. British suspicion of Russia had been fed for years by their rivalry in the Near East. By 1904, these suspicions were deepened by a growing Anglo-Russian rivalry in Manchuria and North China and were brought to a head by Russian construction of the Trans-Siberian Railway, finished in 1905. A violent crisis arose over the Dogger Bank incident in 1904 when the Russian fleet, en route from the Baltic Sea to the Far East, fired on the British fishing vessels in the North Sea in the belief that they were Japanese torpedo boats. The subsequent destruction of that Russian fleet by the Japanese and the ensuing victory of Britain's ally in the Russo-Japanese War of 1905 made it clear to both parties that the agreement between them was possible. German naval rivalry with Britain and the curtailment of Russian ambitions in Asia as a result of the defeat by Japan made possible the agreement of 1907. By this agreement, Persia was divided into three zones of influence, of which the northern was Russian, the southern was British, and the center was neutral. Afghanistan was recognized as under British influence. Tibet was declared to be under Chinese suzerainty, and Britain expressed her willingness to modify the Straits Agreement in a direction favorable to Russia. One influence which worked to create and strengthen the Triple Entente was that of the international banking fraternity. These were largely excluded from the German economic development, but had growing links with France and Russia. Prosperous enterprises like the Suez Canal Company, the Rothschild Copper Enterprise, Rio Tinto in Spain, and many newer joint activities in Morocco created numerous unobtrusive links which both preceded and strengthened the Triple Entente. The Rothschilds, close friends of Edward VII of France, were linked to the French investment bank Banque de Paris et des Pays Bas. This, in turn, was the chief influence in selling 9 billion rubles of Russian bonds in France before 1914. The most influential of London bankers, Sir Ernest Cassel, a great and mysterious person, 1850 to 1921, had come from Germany to England at the age of 17, built up an immense fortune, which he gave away with lavish hand, was closely connected with Egypt, Sweden, New York, Paris, and Latin America, became one of King Edward's closest personal friends and employer of the great wire puller of the period, that ubiquitous mole, Lord Esher. These generally anti-Prussian influences around King Edward played a significant part in building up the Triple Entente and in strengthening it when Germany foolishly challenged their projects in Morocco in the 1904 to 1912 period. All right. The efforts to bridge the gap between the two coalitions 1890 to 1914. At the beginning, and even up to 1913, the two coalitions on the international scene were not rigid or irreconcilably alienated. The links between the members of each group were variable and ambiguous. The Triple Entente was called an Entente just because two of its three links were not alliances. The Triple Alliance was by no means solid, especially in respect to Italy, which had joined it originally to obtain support against the papacy over the Roman question, but which soon tried to obtain support for an aggressive Italian policy in the Mediterranean and North Africa. Failure to obtain specific German support in these areas, and continued enmity with the Austro-Hungary and in the Asiatic, made the Italian link with the Central Powers rather tenuous. We shall mention at least a dozen efforts to bridge the gap, which was slowly forming in the European concert of powers. First, in chronological order, were the Mediterranean Agreements of 1887. In a series of notes, England, Italy, Australia, and Spain agreed to preserve the status quo in the Mediterranean and its adjoining seas, or to see it modified only by mutual agreement. These agreements were aimed at the French ambitions in Morocco and the Russian ambition at the Straits. A second agreement was the Anglo-German Colonial Treaty of 1890, by which German claims in East Africa, especially Zanzibar, were exchanged for the British title to the island of Helgoland in the Baltic Sea. Subsequently, numerous abortive efforts were made by the Kaiser and others on the German side, and by Joseph Chamberlain and others on the British side, to reach some agreement for a common front in world affairs. This resulted in a few minor agreements, such as one of 1898, one of 1899, dividing Samoa, and one of 1900 to maintain the open door in China, but efforts to create an alliance or even an entente broke down over the German naval program. German colonial ambitions in Africa, especially Morocco, and German economic penetration of the Near East along the route of the Berlin to Baghdad Railway. German jealousy of England's world supremacy, especially the Kaiser, resentment towards his uncle, King Edward VII, was ill-concealed. Somewhat similar negotiations were conducted between Germany and Russia, but with meager results. A commercial agreement of 1894 ended with a long-drawn tariff war, much to the chagrin of the German landlords, who enjoyed the previous exclusion of Russian grains, but efforts to achieve any substantial political agreement failed because of the German alliance with Austria, which faced Russia in the Balkans, and the Russian alliance with France, which faced Germany along the Rhine. These obstacles wrecked the so-called Bjorko Treaty, a personal agreement between the Kaiser and Nicholas made during a visit to each other's yachts in 1905. Although the Germans were able to secure Russian consent to the Baghdad Railway by granting the Russians a free hand in northern Persia in 1910. Four other lines of negotiation arose out of the French ambitions to obtain Morocco, the Italian desire to get Tripoli, the Austrian ambition to annex Bosnia, and the Russian determination to open the straits to their warships. All four of these were associated with the declining power of Turkey and offered opportunities for the European powers to support one another's ambitions at the expense of the Ottoman Empire. In 1898, Italy signed a commercial treaty with France and followed this up 2 years later by a political agreement which promised French support for the Italian ambitions in Tripoli in return for Italian support for the French designs in Morocco. The Italians further weakened the Triple Alliance in 1902 by promising France to remain neutral in the event that France was attacked or had to fight in defense of her honor or her security. In a somewhat similar fashion, Russia and Austria tried to reconcile the former's desires to obtain an outlet through the Dardanelles into the Aegean with the latter's desire to control Slav nationalism in the Balkans and reach the Aegean at Saloniki. In 1897, they reached an agreement to maintain the status quo in the Balkans, failing this, to partition the area among the existing Balkan states, plus a new state of Albania. In 1903, these two powers agreed on the program of police and financial reform for the disturbed Turkish province of Macedonia. In 1908, a disagreement over Austrian efforts to construct a railway along Saloniki was glossed over briefly by an informal agreement between the respective foreign ministers, Alexander Islovsky and Lexa von Arienhall, to exchange Austrian approval of the right of Russian warships to traverse the straits for Russian approval of an Austrian annexation of the Turkish provinces of Bosnia and Herzegovina. All this tentative goodwill evaporated in the heat of the Bosnian crisis of 1908, as we shall see in a moment. After 1905, the recurrent international crises and the growing solidarity of the coalitions, except for Italy, made the efforts to bridge the gap between the two coalitions less frequent and less fruitful. However, two episodes are worthy of attention. These are Haldane missions of 1902 and the Baghdad Railway Agreement of 1914. In the former, British Secretary of State for warlord Haldane went to Berlin to try to restrain Tirpitz' naval program. Although the German Navy had been built in the hope that it would bring England to the conference table, and without any real intention of using it in a war with England, the Germans were not able to grasp the opportunity when it occurred. The Germans wanted a conditional promise of British neutrality in the Continental War as a price for suspension of the new naval bill. Since this might lead to German hegemony on the continent, Haldane could not agree. He returned to London convinced that Germans of Goethe and Hegel, which he had learned to love in his student days, was being swallowed up by German militarists. The last bridge between London and Berlin seemed down, but in June 1914, these two countries initialed the agreement by which Britain drew her opposition to the Baghdad Railway in return for a German promise to remain north of the Barca and recognize Britain's preeminence on the Euphrates and Persian Gulf. This solution to a long-standing problem was lost in the outbreak of the war 6 weeks later. All right, that's page 218. What time? All right, I got it. I think that's enough reading for now. We passed the 24-hour mark. Okay, been awake for 24 hours. I'm reading Tragedy and Hope, World War I. I don't know why. I have no clue, but I'm almost like a quarter of the way done with the book, so we're getting there. So if you're checking this out, the link for the PDF of the book is in the description below. Thanks for checking it out, and have a good day. I'll be back later, and peace.